Well, first off, thanks for helping me with my project.
No problem.
Could you maybe say a little bit about yourself?
John Allison, I'm sales operations lead at Seco Environmental. Been in sales operations for about 20 years. Live in Dallas, Texas.
And did you know that NASA is planning to go to the moon in 2024?
I did not.
Now, out of the 150 plus interviews I've done so far, only about 20 of them had heard about it. And I'm just wondering what NASA needs to do different.
I heard about it, but I didn't know that there was actual plan. I heard talk about it, but I didn't know there was an actual plan. So,
Well, what I've noticed, in fact, even one person I interviewed is like, why is NASA keeping it a secret? But I think a lot of it has to do with how we get our news today. And I was just wondering if you thought that might be the case, that since we don't have like the same, people generally don't watch the nightly news, we don't read newspapers, we get all of our content usually online, and it's highly customized to our interest. I was wondering if you felt this
yeah,
was.
I would say that's probably accurate. I mean, people are they're going to gravitate towards what they're interested in, obviously. But people are less likely to be fed news as opposed to seek it out. That's just that's the nature of today.
And what they're fed is very selective too.
Uh-huh.
And one of the benefits of going back that's often touted is inspiring the next generation. But it seems like, how can it inspire if they don't know about it?
Mm-hmm.
I was
Yep.
wondering what your thoughts were there.
Um, yeah, I mean, I guess it's the current generation's job to make sure we teach the next generation about things like that. I try to, as an example, on 9/11, I make sure my kids watch at least one show, right? 10 and 13-year-old, I've heard them refer to it as an accident. And, you have to kind of go back and say, well, it's never framed like that in school, that it was an intentional act, which I think if it isn't repeated, that it was an intentional act, that it wasn't it wasn't just some planes running into a building. That's our fault for not making sure that our children understand what really happened, and why our society is the way it is today.
That's really surprising to me. I did not realize it was framed that way.
Yeah.
I mean, whenever you think about people actually went to flight school with the intention of actually getting
Yeah.
onto planes, and I
Yeah.
mean, it's not.
Well, and explaining to kids why we're at war, right? Why do we have the troops in Afghanistan? Why do we have troops in Iraq? Why do we have troops in Kosovo? Most kids these days have no idea. They weren't around when we went there. So it's our, if our kids, our next generation doesn't understand, it's our fault. Same thing with the space program. I mean, our kids have never saw a space shuttle, right? They never saw a space shuttle re-enter the atmosphere. I've watched it before from the desert in California, right? When a space shuttle comes back into the atmosphere and breaks the sound barrier like 4 times. Something my kids will never see.
That's right, and it's kind of funny. The Cold War seems so long ago, and understanding like the context between like the Apollo moon landings and the contest with Russia or the USSR at that time. I mean, this current generation really is so far removed, I think, from that entire thing.
Yeah, well, now what they understand of Russia is what they hear on the news now, and it's about Russia and Trump, which is it. It is what it is. But when you talk about the moon and us going back to the moon, that's a new race. It's, I think, now the race is against China, right? And that's something else that I think is going to be important for us, is our generation, to teach the next generation, as far as what China really is.
Oh, exactly. I mean, just the fact that you can actually type in things in Google in the United States, like Tiananmen Square and what have you, and get completely different results than you would if you were in China.
Yeah, you don't you don't get that in China. I mean, the kids, people, um, they say, well, they just quarantined a whole town. They quarantined 12 million people, whole city. I was like, you know what they did? They did that with the military. They did it with guys in tanks with machine guns. That's how they got people to stay inside. I was like, do you want that here? And they're like, they don't. And that's not just kids. There's adults who don't understand that and the millennials and what have you that don't understand that that's how China dealt with that situation. Um, there are people on the streets, and I have a coworker who came back from China. He's like, "Oh yeah, military was on the streets,"
Hmm.
but that's not in the news.
Yeah, and also like the economic growth without independent reporting and protection from reciprocity from the government of
Yep.
having contrary figures, how can you really be sure that they're actually having the economic performance that they say they're having?
You don't.
You don't.
No. I deal with it. I deal with it every month. Help trying to manage the our Chinese business's sales pipeline, and every month you got to say what is this really, right? Because they're always their forecast mysteriously always seems to keep rolling over into the next quarter and the next quarter, and it's like, is that real, or are you just making stuff up?
And you wonder about these US companies or global companies that have big operations in China. That's a significant part of their business. Is there a concern that there'll be potential issues there too?
I think there are already. I know we have, just in my business that I'm in now, we have IP issues where we we lock China out of SharePoints. We lock them out of, in our Salesforce instance. They're isolated. Like, they can't see anybody else's data at all. And we keep pretty close tabs on people in that business to what they can do. Like, we don't allow them to export data. We have parts of our business where they won't do business in China because China will just steal their design, and they'll just straight up steal their design, whether it's the customer or a competitor or people locally in the company will steal the design, and it's like stuff that we're the only ones who own it. So and that's just the nature. I mean, China's a different animal.
And I've heard some people say that, that's a good reason to kind of maybe move some of those operations away from China and to maybe not do as much trading with China. But it seems like with like the ability to reverse engineer things and the ability to kind of have corporate espionage, that really doesn't protect you at all either.
No. You can't completely isolate China from the supply chain, but you can't make us 100% dependent on China for the supply chain. And I think there's large parts of our there's parts of our defense industry that are dependent on China from a supply chain perspective. We learned this lesson in the past couple of months of our medical supplies and the supply chain going through China. There's other things. I know that they have a nasty knack of embedding hardware into computer chips and into computers that enables them to spy on other countries. Those are all things that should be considered. But I guess it's given that, right? You have to balance what will we trade with China, what won't we trade with China, or at least make it in balance the other way to where we're getting more out of the deal than they are.
Yeah. And I guess that leads into my next question is, how does space exploration and the development of space resources kind of fit into your set of priorities? I mean, like, do you think us going back to the moon's a good thing or kind of like a misplaced priority?
I think it's good. I think it's good from a um, I think it's good from a national pride perspective. I think it's good from a technology perspective. You look back at the original space exploration, race for the moon. The technology that was developed in support of it was leaps and bounds, right? So now this time around, it's okay. What's that mean? Going to the moon. What are we going to do? Are we going there just to put a new flag on the moon? Are we going there to set up shop to say, okay, how do we live on the moon, right? How do we live outside of our atmosphere? Because I think that's an example of that's where you get that technological leaps and bounds is when we're trying to do things like that. I think that's good, but with limits, right? We don't want to do that to enable other people to steal our intellectual property and to take what we are investing in. And I think that's part of the challenge with China and others is you can't be too trusting that they have the same goals in mind, because while we might be looking at it as a one group, I won't say we because I don't know all the politics involved, but one group might be looking at it as a way to save the planet, right? Another party is looking at it as a way to control the skies, right? We don't know who those parties are, but you got to make sure that it's balanced as far as who's involved and who's trusted to be part of it.
Yeah, and also you look at like China and the Spratly Island. So where they, and with the moon, China's already kind of announced that they plan to land people on the moon in the 30s, and they see it as a strategic resource in terms of mining and space materials. In fact, they found water ice in the poles of the moon. There's like, the moon only has a 1 degree tilt and has like these deep craters that are always in the shadow, and it's like colder than the surface of Pluto. And so anything that gets in there, it's pretty much stuck. And over billions of years, ice has built up. So I mean, key strategic resources potentially. But I guess how much of that do you think is a valid consideration of if we didn't go to the moon and China still stuck with their 2030 plans, and they were there first and they effectively kind of controlled what could be done on the moon. How big of a risk do you see that?
A big risk, because it's China. I mean, you look at Mao's book, The Long March, right? Nothing they do is tactical. Nothing is there for instant gratification. Everything that China does is a calibrated move towards basically regaining that stature as the dominant power on the planet. So, I would say it would be, it's not in our strategic interests to allow China to do that alone. To do it independently, whether we're in competition with them or we're working with them. I think it'd be naive for us to say, oh yeah, they have good intentions, because time and time again, and they could say the same thing about the U.S. You'd question their intentions, right? You look at coronavirus, right? Why didn't we find out sooner what was going on? Was it intentional? No, I don't know. Was it them covering their ass? I don't know. But when you talk about going into space and doing space exploration, it's I don't think it's something we could afford not to be involved in.
Yeah. I also just looking at the way that the news is kind of control and selective, and the power of and the long strategic kind of approach that China has. I mean, it seems like most people would not recognize the threat that potentially China poses. That it's It's,
Well, most people don't, right? Most people don't know that China owns the Port of Long Beach. Most people don't know that China owns and controls the Panama Canal Zone. Most people don't know that China owns and controls the largest port on the east coast of the United States. Most people don't know that because they're ignorant. You know, it's blissful ignorance, right? They don't know. But what they don't realize, if push came to shove, right? China controls the largest import-export terminals in the U.S. Controls them. I mean, the Port of Long Beach, they own it. And I think they even own the Port of Oakland. And in 89, 91, when we left Panama, you know who took over? The Chinese.
No.
They own it. It's theirs. So if they want to stop us from our aircraft carriers from going to the Pacific to the Atlantic Ocean, they can. They have the ability to shut down that path. And people don't understand
that. Can aircraft carriers fit in the Panama Canal?
They've been designed so they can fit.
That's interesting.
What was the last one that they built? It was the original design was too big. It was too wide, and they had to redesign part of the aircraft carrier so it would fit.
Wow. I guess maybe part of the actual flight surface or landing surface extends over the edges.
Yeah.
Interesting. So do you have any personal interest in going to space? I mean, if it was safe and affordable, would you take a...
No.
No?
I'm good. No, I do think, I mean, I don't like the idea of us paying $20,000 for a toilet seat. But I understand why toilet seats cost $20,000 in the space program. If it's going to be done by anybody, I think we should participate. In fact, I think we should lead, but make sure that we reap the benefits that are byproduct of that investment, because it's not something that's going to be cheap. You're talking trillions of dollars would be spent. And a lot of that is in research and development. And I think if, as a taxpayer, if we're going to invest $1 trillion to put some dude on the moon, I want to get the benefit out of, I want some benefit out of it from a personal perspective or from a national security perspective, or just culturally, want some of that benefit. And we'll end up paying, whether it's us by ourselves or us in China or us in Russia and us in France, whoever, right? We're going to end up paying the lion's share because we always do.
And did you have any comments in closing? Anything?
No, that's interesting. I didn't know that it was, when you sent that, I was kind of like, huh. But no, I didn't know that there was an official plan. I heard him talk about it. I heard him talk, oh, we're going to go to Mars. And it's like, well, hey, let's think smaller and let's go to the moon first. But I didn't know that they'd officially targeted a date to go back. I think that's good. I think it's, hopefully politics won't get in the way of it.
I hope not. It's definitely, it's definitely, I mean, the head of NASA says it's like Lucy and the football. Like every time they come up with a plan, then they start running towards that plan, and then Lucy jerks the football away.
And what's your interest? I mean, what's your play in this?
It's just a personal passion.
Oh, cool.
I just always, I just think the idea that this generation is going to be sort of like the Christopher Columbus of outer space. Looking at what Elon Musk is doing down there in Brownsville, Texas, with development of that reusable rocket that he's planning to mass manufacture. Looking at what Jeff Bezos is doing with his Blue Origin, and it just feels like, barring some big catastrophe, and hopefully COVID-19 is not that catastrophe. Well, It may not. It may be like allergies. Maybe the COVID-19 is okay, but the reaction to it isn't.
Oh, yeah, the reaction to it is, nobody wants to get sick and nobody wants to die. One of my a guy I worked with at HP before I left, Dan was a PhD in astrophysics. So he's a numbers guy, he's a data guy. And he built a dashboard that literally pulls CDC data from the flu, the pneumonia, and COVID, and then compares it to everything else that people die of. And it's like a drop in the hat. So it's like people are panicking, and it's like the overall death rate from all causes is down this year, right? Now, granted, we've all been stuck at home, right? We're not out doing stupid things, but when you compare it to, heart disease, COVID-19 is a fraction, like a very small fraction. And I think that's what we get back to the news and what the news tells us. That's one of the things that hasn't been communicated, right? That hasn't been brought to the surface. It's always negative news. It's not really putting into perspective a wider picture.
Well, and I think if it wasn't for sort of those stories and images coming out of northern Italy, I don't think we would have had this reaction. But it's like once you started creating that chain, it's like hard to undo.
Well, it bleeds, it leads. I mean, it's bad news. Bad news is good news for a news outlet, right? And what they never said and I spent time in Bergamo, in Milan, right where that was happening, and it's a very aged population, and they had daily flights from Milan to Wuhan, China. I mean, like exactly. 2 flights a day.
Wow. Yeah, exactly.
The 100,000, 140,000 people in Milan were Chinese. So it's a dirty, old, dirty city. I've been there. But that's something that they give you the bad. Oh my God, it's just spontaneously all these people are dying. And it's like, yeah, but you got to understand that these old people were on tours and groups of people going to China and hanging out and then coming back, and people from China coming in daily. Those are the parts of the news, the story that never made it out, that would kind of probably make people rationalize it differently, or it was just bad news.
Yeah, for sure. I think we've set ourselves up for political unrest regardless of what happens next. Either in the next month or two, there won't be bodies piling up, and people will be like, why do we have this shutdown? Why did we do this to ourselves? Or we will have bodies piling up, and we'll be like, why did we, open up everything? So.
Yeah. The problem is now the only people who are telling us to keep it closed are people who aren't losing paychecks.
Yes. That's true.
Real easy for a politician to tell us to keep it locked down because he's getting paid. But when you're a small business owner, or hell, I mean, everybody's affected. I mean, I know a lot of people who've either already gone through furloughs or going through furloughs. People have been laid off. Those people, they don't want to die, but they also don't want to basically eviscerate their children's future.
Exactly. Yeah.
Hey, I got a boogie. Nathan, it was good to help you out on this. This is interesting. But I got to jump to another meeting. So
sounds good. Thank you, John.
Take it easy, Nathan.
Bye.